we're gonna go with the next session. The next talk is titled, A Meta-Analysis of Forgiveness Education Interventions. And the speaker for that session is Miss Hannah Rapp. Hannah Rapp is a PhD candidate in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Hannah works as a research assistant with Dr. Robert Enright, validating measures of agape love and implementing forgiveness education interventions for primary school children in 3 world nations, including Israel, Northern Ireland, and Taiwan. Hannah was a 2020 Future Institute Research Center Graduate Scholarship Award recipient and has presented at relevant conferences such as the WES Center for International Higher Education Conference in 2021 and the American Psychological Association Convention in 2020. Let's welcome Hannah to the stage.
Hello, everyone. As Ji-Chan said, I'm Hannah Rapp, and I get to present to you today the very first meta-analysis of forgiveness education interventions. But before I explain what a meta-analysis is, I'm going to do a quick intro of very important things. So I have up here a picture of my favorite pizza place in Madison, Wisconsin, Ian's Pizza, located on State and Francis Street. And I decided to include it here because if you remember anything about Madison, Wisconsin, after you leave this conference, it might just be how great Ian's Pizza is. Secondly, I have a picture of the Enright Forgiveness Lab. That's our group that meets every other Friday, and we discuss innovations in forgiveness and agape love. In this picture, we have 5 nations represented. We do also have men in our group, but they are not in the photo, and I just noticed that. And as Ji-Chan said, I'm a doctoral candidate, and Dr. Enright is my advisor in the Department of Educational Psychology. So all of the takeaways I'm going to be talking about today come from this article that we just published in the Journal of Child Development. It's a peer-reviewed journal, and this is open access, so anything that I don't talk enough about, you can just look up afterwards, which is pretty great. So now to get into it. What if we could measure the outcome of forgiveness education in a classroom of 30 children? That would be pretty great because we could see how forgiveness education benefits not just a few children, but a larger group. But now, what if we could expand that vision and not just 30 children, but give forgiveness education to 50 children, 100 children, 1,000 children? That's exactly what we can do with a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a type of analysis that combines the participant samples of many different research studies across the world that ask the same research question. So in this case, all the researchers from different parts of the world were asking how forgiveness education interventions affect children and adolescents. Today we have 2 objectives. First, we're going to look at these omnibus analyses of anger and forgiveness. So we're going to see in our 1,000-student sample how children and adolescents who went through the forgiveness education intervention saw changes in forgiveness levels and anger levels. And then secondly, we're going to look at moderator analyses. So what factors make one forgiveness education more effective than another? So for example, gender is sort of a standard moderator variable that we look at. So if there's a higher percentage of females in a classroom, will that change the outcome of the intervention? Or maybe more like the duration of the intervention is another pretty standard moderator variable. So having more lessons in an intervention, will that make it more effective than another intervention? Okay, so where do we get our 1,000-student sample? We get it from 20 different studies that took place in different parts of the world. And you might even recognize some of these studies because some of the countries you are from today. So we had 10 countries that we drew these studies from. And you can see some of the characteristics from each intervention, such as the percent of females and the amount of lessons in each intervention, and the curriculum types, and also the amount of participants in each treatment group and the control group. In total, we had 1,472 participants, and the average age of the participant was 12 years old. I want to draw your attention to the curriculum type because I am not using the curriculum that you all used in this project. I'm combining all the different types of forgiveness curriculums. So, for example, there's 2 REACH model curriculums, and 9 of them are Enright process-based model curriculums. So what all these curriculums had in common is they all taught the benefits of forgiveness and the process of forgiveness, but they did so in different ways. So, for example, the ones we labeled story-based curriculums were the ones you're very familiar with, where there were standard curriculums. They all used stories to teach the ingredients of forgiveness. And the process-based still used the Enright 4-phase process model of forgiveness, which we'll talk about, other people will talk about it later. But essentially, they assigned activities and objectives to each of the 4 phases, but these were not standard curriculums. Every researcher did it a little bit differently. I also wanted to highlight some of the unique populations from each of these studies we're drawing from. Even though I'm pooling the participants, these studies were from different parts of the world and had very different populations. So, for example, Friedman implemented her forgiveness education intervention in an alternative school with students at risk of dropping out. Park and Beck recruited adolescents who had been identified as aggressive victims of bullying. Friedman and Nupp administered forgiveness education interventions with adolescents who had experienced parental divorce. Rahman reported on female participants who had been removed from abusive situations and were living in the Child Protection and Welfare Bureau of Lahore, Pakistan. Shechman implemented a forgiveness education intervention with Arab adolescents in Israel. Bonab intervention was among 8th grade students in 3 distinct provinces in Iran. Enright supported multiple education interventions in Belfast Center City, which was characterized by an interface, Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods being close to each other. And Happ, Dex, and Holter had interventions that took place in elementary schools in urban US areas such as New York and Milwaukee. So these are just some of the studies of the 20, but each is very unique and could be read in and of itself and give results on that population. Okay, so I have 8 takeaways today from this meta-analysis of our 1,000-student classroom. The first 2 takeaways I want to talk about are about how forgiveness education interventions seem to help children to be less angry and, surprisingly, more forgiving. So 15 of the 20 studies had measures that measured forgiveness. Most of them used the Enright Forgiveness Inventory, or the EFI. Here I have a forest plot of the summary effects, so I'm going to explain this really quick. What we have in the G is called the effect size, and the effect size is the difference, the average of the experimental group's forgiveness scores minus the average of the control group's forgiveness scores in standard deviation units. So each of these 13 studies that measured forgiveness has a unique effect size or difference between the control and the experimental group, and then those are averaged for the summary effect of 0.54 standard deviations. So now just some guidelines on how to interpret that 0.54. A small effect would be 0.2, a medium is 0.5, and a large is 0.8. So on average, students had a medium to large positive, significant positive effect for forgiveness. So forgiveness education interventions did help children and adolescents to forgive when compared to comparison groups. Our second takeaway, we look at the studies, the 13 that measured anger. And so for anger, we have an effect size of 0.29. I'll bring up our guidelines again. That's a positive, significant, small to medium effect. It's kind of easy to convert this also into percentages. So what that would mean in another way is that the average participant in the forgiveness education intervention group experienced a greater change in anger over the course of the intervention than 61% of the comparison group, or the group that did not receive forgiveness education. So secondly, we move to our objective, which is the moderator analyses, or the characteristics that make some interventions more effective than others. And we have our program characteristics, such as, like I said, the number of lessons, and our participant characteristics, such as the age. Are older children more affected by this intervention than younger children? The first program characteristic I wanted to look at was instructor type, because we had teachers and guidance counselors administrating forgiveness education interventions, and we also had PhD candidates like myself and psychologists who were administrating the forgiveness education. So you can see how many studies each facilitator type. We had 9 that were from teachers and 11 from researchers. And you can also see the effect size, which is the G. And I had those guidelines still apply to this as well. So what we found was that both facilitator types are effective. These are both positive effect sizes of the outcomes of anger and forgiveness, and they're both significant. And the researcher is slightly larger, like medium to large effect size, but then again, there's like 11 studies and 9 studies. So I think the biggest conclusion is both are positive, significant effects. And secondly, we looked at the duration of the program, and I brought up, again, the amount of sessions. So the average amount of sessions per intervention among these 20 studies was about 13, which is quite large. And for this continuous variable, we did a meta-regression, and once again, we did not find statistical significance for this moderator of session duration. So in this case, we weren't actually that surprised, since the average was 13 studies, and that studies that had, or programs that had a bit more lessons than 13 or less lessons than 13 were still significant. So the duration in this case was not a significant moderator of treatment efficacy. We also, switching to participant characteristics, looked at offense severity, which refers to the degree of which an offense is more difficult to overcome. So longer lasting transgressions appear to take a longer time to forgive. So we coded mild offenses and severe offenses among these student populations. The Enright Forgiveness Inventory actually has a place where you can report the offense types. So we were able, among the studies that had that, to read what had happened to most of the students. But as you can see, some of them have not stated, so we didn't include 5 of the studies in this particular analysis. And what we found from this is that the students who had experienced the most severe offenses, sorry, I wanted to pull something up. There it is, okay. Had the largest effects in terms of forgiveness growth and anger reduction. In fact, this is larger than large. This is a huge effect size of 1.21 standard deviations. So those 3 studies we looked at a little bit more closely, and there might be some confounding variables because they were all conducted by psychologists and in a very small classroom settings, or group settings, rather than larger classrooms. But this is just an amazing effect size. But also participants who had mild offenses also saw positive, significant increases in forgiveness and decreases in anger. So the answer to our question, do forgiveness education interventions with students who have experienced more severe offenses on average have stronger effects? And the answer was most likely yes. Okay, Our sixth takeaway we looked at was grade, and we divided grade by academic division. So we had first through third as our lower primary, fourth through fifth, upper primary, middle school was sixth through eighth, and 9 to 12 was high school. And for these subgroups, we found that early primary, or grades 1 through 3, was the only academic division that wasn't significant. So one possible explanation for that is that younger children, or children younger than 7, may not have experienced as severe offenses. And again, we were only measuring forgiveness and anger, so they might have seen effects that weren't significant as compared to the control group for forgiveness and anger, but for some other benefits, we might have those just not in this particular meta-analysis. As I said before, one standard moderator that most meta-analyses look at is gender. And when we looked at the percent of females in each intervention to code for gender, we did not see significant effects. So the interventions that had a higher percentage of female participants were just as affected as the interventions with equivalent male participants. And finally, income level, I would say, was one of our more creative moderators to look at. So we looked at whether or not forgiveness education interventions were more or less effective in economically disadvantaged areas. Some of the studies explicitly talked about the income level of the area they were in. Others, we looked up the mean income level of the nation and then the area of the school, and then coded based on that. And so what we found was that the effect sizes were pretty much significantly positive, but also equivalent in both areas. So both, regardless of whether the school was located in an economically disadvantaged or economically advantaged area, students were positively affected by forgiveness education interventions. So we first looked at forgiveness and anger outcomes of our 1,000 students across the world. We found that the forgiveness education intervention group had significantly higher levels of forgiveness and lower levels of anger than comparison groups. Then we looked at possible factors that can make one forgiveness intervention more effective than the other. We found that many factors do not matter, with the possible exceptions of offense severity, which benefited students who had suffered severe offenses greatly, and a grade level, where we saw younger children were not as affected during interventions. But please take these results as a first look, because this was 20 studies, and studies are published every week, and so future populations could alter these results. Thank you.